The main Palestinian factions, Fatah and Hamas, have signed an agreement to unify the West Bank and Gaza after 4 years of political division. We discussed this development with Rashid Khalidi, the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies at Columbia University and the editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies. Welcome to Palestine Studies TV. I'm your host, Will Yeomans. Thank you for joining us, Professor Khalidi.
Pleasure.
We received a question from Twitter. Badia asks, what sort of concrete changes will happen for everyday Palestinians with this agreement?
The changes began, I think, even before this agreement was formally signed, with the opening up of the Rafah crossing by the Egyptian authorities back about a month ago. And this was part of the regional changes in Egypt and in Syria that I think facilitated this agreement. And I think that will actually considerably help the people of Gaza, who now have much freer ability to enter and exit their besieged strip, or besieged region, 30 some odd miles by 10 miles, which has sort of been a prison for the last 5 or 6 years. What changes will follow on this agreement very much depends on how faithfully it's followed. But assuming that, as seems to be the case, some parts of it are going to be carried out, one thing that I think we will see is the unification of the non-security elements of the Palestinian Authority and an extension of a number of programs that are now only operating in the West Bank to the Gaza Strip. A second thing that I think we're likely to see is much freer political activity and less political repression, both in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, as both factions and all other Palestinian groups gear up for elections that are supposed to take place in a year. And a third thing that I think we're likely to see is the severe punishment of the Palestinian Authority by Israel and those of its backers whom it can blackmail or bludgeon into following it and taking punitive sanctions against the Palestinians for unifying and for doing something that Israel did not want them to do. Israel has already withheld Palestinian tax revenues, that is, say, Palestinian revenues that are the property of the Palestinian people, which the Israelis are stealing, or at least confiscating for the moment, and it will, through its supporters in Congress, undoubtedly push for the halting of U.S. aid. This is going to impact Palestinians, I think, sooner or later, both by Israel withholding aid and very likely at some stage in the near future, the United States withholding aid on the grounds that the American law prevents material support to any so-called terrorist entity. Laws passed by our Congress, and which essentially are designed not so much to strike at terrorists who have attacked the United States, but essentially to strike at enemies of Israel. So it's a case of U.S. law serving essentially Israeli interests. And I'm afraid that that'll probably be an effect that the Palestinian people will see fairly soon.
Israel and the United States were able to effectively pressure the unity government that was formed after the 2006 parliamentary elections. What's different now? What's to prevent another fissure between Hamas and Fatah coming because of international or regional pressures?
The biggest difference is the earthquake that's affected the entire Arab world, and which is one of the main reasons that there is an agreement between these two factions. Mm-hmm. The state of Arab disarray, the decadent authoritarian regimes, most of them aligned with the United States, but in the case of Syria, not, held up the status quo in Palestine, effectively supported Israel's occupation, and was the major factor, besides pressure from Israel and the United States, in keeping the Palestinians divided. That stagnant status quo has now broken like a logjam in the spring. I mean, the Arab Spring has burst the entire regional structure, which effectively upheld Israel's occupation, and which was instrumental in keeping the Palestinians divided. Specifically, the fall of the Mubarak regime removed the major obstacle to Palestinian reconciliation. The so-called malaf, the folder of Palestinian reconciliation, was in the hands of Ahmad Suleiman for 4 years. For those 4 years, he worked ceaselessly to ensure there would be no Palestinian reconciliation, because that was Egyptian policy, that was Israeli policy, and that was American policy. And he faithfully followed that policy. Within 2 months of Ahmad Suleiman's disappearance, Egyptian military intelligence, the same agency that he headed, brokered a reconciliation agreement it's impossible not to conclude that the fall of the regime in Egypt removed the largest obstacle to Palestinian reconciliation, which means the Mubarak regime was a faithful agent of American and Israeli policy and of its own paranoid fantasies about Hamas. And so this is an enormously different Arab world that this reconciliation agreement emerges into than existed in 2006 when the Palestinian elections took place, 2007 when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip, and the intervening years when various reconciliation efforts, first by Saudi Arabia and later by the Egyptians, failed. The second important, almost as important, change in the regional environment is the significant weakening of the Syrian regime, which was one of the two major supporters of Hamas. Hamas has refused to do what the Syrian regime demands of its clients and stooges, which is to completely support the line of the government that all dissent in Syria is a result of external manipulation and subversion, partly because Hamas has sympathy for some of the people engaged in this popular uprising inside Syria. And so Hamas is being punished by the regime. And moreover, given the weakening of the regime, even if there weren't this difference, is in a much more insecure position than it was before the Arab Spring finally reached Damascus, slightly belatedly. So the international environment maybe hasn't changed very much, but certainly the Arab environment has changed enormously as a result of the revolutions that started in Tunisia in December and brought down the Tunisian and the Egyptian dictators. So I would say that that's one reason to assume that there will be different outcomes, perhaps.
That reminds me of an op-ed that Jimmy Carter wrote about this issue recently. He mentioned that this was the Arab Spring within Palestine, or somehow a result of that. Well, that raises the question, what are the domestic factors behind this?
Well, I mean, I think you raise a very good point, and I think Carter was right. This reconciliation did not only happen because the external situation changed. It happened because the Palestinians have been fed up with both of their leaderships for a very long time. Both Fatah and Hamas have very low levels of support in the regions that they control. Hamas is particularly unpopular in Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority of Mahmoud Abbas is particularly unpopular in the West Bank. And both are considered to have failed to advance the strategy for liberation. Both are perceived to be guilty of putting narrow partisan interests above the national interest. And both have been the target of enormous pressure from civil society to do something different than the narrow partisan course of basically fighting each other rather than doing anything about the main problem the Palestinians face, which is occupation and dispossession. And this finally burst into the open when people started to demonstrate in very tightly controlled Gaza, as well as in the very tightly controlled West Bank, starting in March. So there has always been pressure. I mean, I detect it every time I go to Palestine on the two Palestinian authorities, both of whose legitimacy has lapsed, both of whom, in fact, have long since ceased to be legal constitutional governments because the terms of office of all of the parliament, the Palestinian Legislative Council, has ended. There have been no new elections because of the split. The ministers have never been submitted, and the government has never been submitted to Parliament, the Palestinian Legislative Council, and the president's term has ended. So this is an entirely illegal structure, and it is perceived as not just illegitimate in constitutional terms. It is perceived as having failed to achieve Palestinian national objectives by most of Palestinian public opinion. Every poll tells us that. So this finally burst into the open in March in response to the revolutions shaking the Arab world, as people finally were able, in Ramallah, in Gaza, to come out into the streets in the face of quite fearsome security presences in both cases. Hamas and Fatah have shown themselves to be authoritarian brothers under the skin in their treatment of dissent. And so there was enormous pressure from below, as it were, which obviously was encouraged by the Arab Spring, which was encouraged by the fall of the pharaoh in Cairo, and encouraged by the weakening of the Syrian regime as a result of the Syrian people's rising up.
And we have another question from Twitter here. Abdullah wants to know more about Hamas's involvement. He asks if this represents a strategic change for the group, or is it merely a tactic within a pre-existing strategy?
it's a little hard for me to say. You'll see in the next issue of the Journal, I believe the next issue of the Journal, an interview that the Journal did with Osama Hamdan, who is in effect Hamas's foreign secretary or foreign minister. And I think that if you compare what's happened now with what he said, there's no apparent change. So this doesn't seem on the surface to represent a major shift. I would say, though, that Hamas has probably been shaken by popular dissatisfaction in the Gaza Strip. I think Hamas has been shaken by the loss of its, or not the loss, but the weakening of its patron in Damascus and the weakening of its relationship with the Syrian regime. And I think that, frankly, there's nothing that they have to show for 5 years in power in Gaza. They have not successfully liberated 1 square inch of Palestinian territory. They haven't moved the cause one bit with their strategy. And they are blamed as much as Fatah for the division. So I don't see an enormous strategic shift. There may be a tactical shift, but I would argue that the main changes have come from below and from without, rather than from inside Fatah or inside Hamas. The only thing that I would say is that, as you could see in the statement that Khalid Mash'al made in Cairo, Hamas is still talking about a 2-state solution. This is not a strategic shift. Hamas is just as committed as Fatah to the 2-state solution. The difference is Hamas wants to do this somehow without recognizing Israel. But it is committed to a 2-state solution of a Palestinian state living in peace side by side with an Israeli state. How you square that with non-recognition of Israel, you'd have to ask the theologians of Hamas. It's incomprehensible to me, but, there we are. That position has not changed. That theological position has not changed. How many angels can dance on a head of a pin type of question has to be asked to them. So, in fact, there's no strategic shift here. What Mash'al said in Cairo, and which was shockingly reported on the front page by the New York Times, in this morning's paper, in fact, is the old standard Hamas policy.
And I want to ask about the U.S.'s response. There seems to be debate within the foreign policy establishment as to whether this is a good thing or not. This is in stark contrast, of course, with the lack of debate in Congress. We know that Congress is considering a resolution that would prohibit U.S. aid to Palestine. Well, what's your sense of the U.S. position?
I perceive that there's going to be a battle fought out in 4 arenas. One is going to be media and public opinion. And that and Congress are almost coterminous. And sanity and logic and reality will not prevail. We had Michael Oren in full braying form on National Public Radio, given a podium, given a bully pulpit to spread his misinformation, disinformation, distortion, and propaganda. And I can see where that's going. Public opinion in Congress are going to be taken to a position that these are supporters of Osama bin Laden, these are bloodthirsty terrorists, these are the murderers of children in Sderot, these are allies of Iran. The article in the New York Times, which actually mentioned the fact that Hamas is in favor of a 2-state solution, did not fail to mention in line 2 that Hamas is aligned with Iran. So it is clear to me that in the American mainstream media, and in Congress, which is going to do exactly what it's told to do by AIPAC, as always is the case, this is a lost battle. Now, where will it also be fought? It will also be fought out in, I guess, what you could call elite opinion among the foreign policy establishment, and opinion among savvy people like most students who are interested in this issue, most people in the Jewish community who are liberal and do not believe anything AIPAC says ever, and most other sane individuals in the United States and the world who are going to see that this is in fact and in Israel, including many people in Israel, who are going to say, rightly, that this is probably a very good thing, and that measures to try and oppose Palestinian unity are measures, in fact, against peace, and against the resolution of the conflict, or an attempt to maintain the status quo of occupation, colonization, immiseration of the Palestinian people. That is what Israel and the United States stand for, in effect, and that's what they want to continue. And that's what will, I think, in the end, be U.S. and Israeli policy. Now, this second set of debates that are debates among sane people talking about reality, rather than the bizarro world which is Congress and the mainstream media, the world created by AIPAC and the world created by Israeli disinformation. In the sane world, there will be a debate which I think will affect the administration. And it will affect the administration for two reasons. The first is they understand this as a struggle between the legislative and the executive branches. And no president, whatever his position on Israel, wants to have the foreign policy of the United States dictated by Congress. This is an old issue that has nothing to do with Israel, nothing to do with Palestine. And so this administration, even though it is worm-eaten by the likes of Dennis Ross, people who essentially are shills for Israel, even though it is full of people who see things in terms of what Congress wants, what public opinion wants, and most importantly, what will get the president reelected in November 2012. That is the holy grail of this administration. In spite of the fact that this debate inside the administration is going to be carried on one side by that lot, it will be carried on the other side by people who will be saying, firstly, the president cannot allow himself to be dictated to by Congress. No president, under any circumstances, can allow this. Secondly, by people who are in what we like to call the reality-based community, and who will point out the United States taking the side of Israel on this is going to put it in an even worse situation in a more democratic Arab world than it was in the dictatorially dominated Arab world with which the United States was so comfortable 3 months ago. This will be a yet another terrible blow to American credibility, American standing, American authority in the Arab world. And so the president will be listening on the one side to shills for Israel, to people who are arguing electoral considerations, and on the other side to people who are arguing the authority of the executive is being challenged here, and this would be a stupid policy to follow for American foreign policy and for reasons of the American national interest. The president, in the end, will go with the first group, I would predict, and American aid will probably be cut off.
So what do you think is going to happen with this agreement?
I should never predict anything because either the president may, find his backbone on this issue, or leadership may be taken by others. I mean, just to conclude this, it may be that a European policy, it may be that a United Nations policy, it may be the policy led by countries like Turkey, Russia, India, China, countries that understand that this is essentially an absolutely essential precondition for breaking the logjam in Palestine-Israel, will lead the way. And that even if the United States does cut off aid, that won't have the same effect. And that the administration will be sheepishly forced to follow the lead of people who are within the reality-based community rather than living in the never-never land created by AIPAC and the Netanyahu government. That is also a possibility. I wouldn't count on it in what in a few months is going to be an election.
Tony Blair said that the international community's support for any unity Palestinian government would still rest on the quartet's conditions, recognizing Israel, abandoning terrorism, and committing to previous agreements signed by the PLO and Israel. To what extent are these conditions still feasible?
Remember, the Palestinians have agreed to have a government of technocrats for the next 12 months. It may be that Hamas will accept that such a government accepts such conditions, in which case the can will be kicked down the road 12 months till after elections. Whether the quartet in the United States accepts that, and whether the lobby will be denied, the blood that it's after, which is to cut money off to the PA and weaken the Palestinians. That's what Israel's after, and that's what the lobby will try and enable. It is impossible to say. Tony Blair on this is a sort of running dog of the United States, as the Chinese would have called him. I heard his interview yesterday on the BBC. Of course, he sticks to these four conditions. Of course, he is eager to see Hamas meet them, because he himself was in office as Prime Minister of Britain when the quartet produced these conditions, and because he sees things from an Israeli perspective. In his view, a Palestinian Authority which doesn't demand anything of Israel and does everything Israel wants is the natural condition. I mean, the status quo is the right thing. A Palestinian Authority that takes Western aid money in order to arrest and torture Palestinians while Israel is continuing settlement activity, while Israel is continuing to harm the Palestinian economy, while Israel is continuing to besiege Gaza, is perfectly acceptable. The whole structure in the view of a lot of Palestinians, I think, the whole structure of the negotiations, the whole structure created by the negotiations, is flawed. And that negotiations, as the Egyptians have said, should take place on a new basis with some kind of new international forum, would probably be the right Palestinian negotiating position. I think the disappointment that even the most fervent advocates of negotiating through Washington have felt with the Obama administration is one of the things that has driven them to this. If we want to look at the reasons why this has come about, one of them is that the Abbas government, the Fayyad Abbas leadership in Ramallah, feel themselves to have been gravely disappointed by the failure of the Obama administration to do anything to help them, anything whatsoever to help. And I think they may have realized that there's absolutely no hope for any positive, anything positive in the United States for the next 2 years. So why continue to bend and kneel and kowtow and accept submissively whatever it is people in Washington say when they don't give you anything in return, except the money which helps them to do, the Americans to do, and the Israelis to do what they want. So we shall see. I have no idea how this is going to work out, but I think that there are many intermediate stages which, if the Europeans, if other countries are, and for that matter, if the Palestinians are resourceful, might lead to things that, while they would never satisfy this Israeli government, or in my view, very likely the American administration, might lead to a situation where all aid is not cut off. Maybe American aid, but not other aid. Maybe not European or UN aid. And some of that aid might be substituted for by Arab or other sources. You know, I personally have come around to a Tea Party view as far as American foreign aid is concerned. I think that American military aid should be stopped entirely. I don't see it doing any good except fostering war and death and destruction. I think American security aid to dictatorships, which is pretty much the only aid security aid the United States gives, should be stopped entirely. And as far as I'm concerned, the economic aid is the back of the bus. I don't think it's not important, frankly. It's not the lion's share of U.S. aid in most cases, nor in Pakistan, nor in Egypt, certainly not in Israel. All aid to Israel is military aid. And in the case of Palestine, as far as I'm concerned, aid to Palestinian security forces, which do the work of Israel without protecting Palestinians, is monstrously misbegotten on the part of the Palestinians. I don't see why the Palestinians are taking American money in order to repress their own people in a situation where Israel is not reciprocating. If Israel were dismantling the occupation, if Israel were rolling back settlement, removing settlers, closing down settlements, negotiating in good faith on issues like the right of return, on issues like Jerusalem, on issues like water, giving up water resources, then you might have an argument for saying, well, Palestinian security forces should both protect the security of Palestinians and prevent the agreement from being disrupted, or potential agreement from being disrupted by attacks on Israelis. But in a situation where Israel is expanding settlement, is further entrenching its occupation, is refusing to negotiate in good faith, I don't see why the Palestinians want that. I mean, if they want to preserve security and do so in whatever way they choose, that's their business. But if American aid is conditional on doing something which is entirely a one-way street, Israel gets what it wants, Palestinians get nothing that they want, then good riddance to such aid. I'm sure there are many, many salaries that are dependent on it. There are many, many families that are dependent on it. There's going to be a lot of hardship involved in ending that aid if it is in fact ended. But that is a factor, but it's only one factor, and what is ultimately a political one.
Thank you very much, Professor Khalidi. We appreciate you being on Palestine Studies TV.
It was a pleasure, as always.